Hello, everyone. My name is Joseph Papa, and I'm the co-chair of the Library of Virginia's Literary Awards Celebration and a member of the Library of Virginia's Foundation Board. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this evening and in the future virtually. We're so thrilled to welcome two of our three nonfiction finalists for the Library of Virginia's Literary Award. This evening, we have John Woodrow Cox and Carolyn Eastman, and their conversation will be moderated by host of the Stacks podcast, Tracy Thomas. We're sorry that Caroline Janney could not join us tonight. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the generosity of the donors who make the library's work possible. Most notably this evening, Amazon and Dominion Energy as the presenting sponsors of the 2022 Literary Awards. And now I'd like to introduce you to this evening's participants. John Woodrow Cox is the author of Children Under Fire: An American Crisis, is a staff writer for the Washington Post and was a finalist for the 2018 Pulitzer Prize in Feature Writing and has won Scripps Howard's Ernie Pyle Award for Human Interest Storytelling, the Dart Award for Excellence in Coverage of Trauma, and Columbia Journalism School Mike Berger Award for Human Interest Reporting, among other honors. He attended the University of Florida, where he taught narrative writing and currently serves on the Department of Journalism's Advisory Council. He lives outside Washington, D.C. Carolyn Eastman, the author of The Strange Genius of Mr. O, The World of the United States' First Forgotten Celebrity. Carolyn is a professor of history at Virginia Commonwealth University and had a 2022-2023 National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar. And was 2022-2023 National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar. She's a graduate of Johns Hopkins University, and her first book, A Nation of Speechifiers, Making an American Public After the Revolution, received the James Broussard Best First Book Prize from the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. Her writings have appeared in the Smithsonian Magazine, the William & Mary Quarterly, Early American Literature, among others. The book that she's being honored for, The Strange Genius of Mr. O, has already won the James Bradford Best Biography Prize earlier this summer. Your moderator this evening, Tracy Thomas, is an avid reader and book lover who created the acclaimed podcast, The Stacks, in order to talk about books in the way that they shape our culture and cultural understanding of race, gender, politics, and what it means to be alive. Weekly guests range from academic thought leaders to best-selling authors, from actors to politicians, and more. She's interviewed the likes of Ibram X. Kendi, Angelina Jolie, Britt Bennett, DeSusan Mero, Quentin Tarantino, and many, many more on The Stacks. She also writes a monthly bookish advice column on shereads.com. Tracy lives in LA with her husband and two adorable twins. You can find her on Instagram at The Stacks Pod. And without further ado, I'd love to turn it over to Tracy.
Hi, Joseph. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have to just tell everyone at home, I lost my voice yesterday cheering on playoff baseball because in addition to books, I love sports. So I hope that you'll bear with me tonight. I won't be talking too much, but I'm thrilled to be here tonight and so honored to be part of this celebration. And without further ado, let's bring up Carolyn and John and dive right in. Hi, how are you all today?
Good. Thank you, Tracy.
I'm so honored to get to talk to two acclaimed writers, and I can't wait to dive in. I have read your books, but maybe some of the people at home haven't. So will each of you take 60 to 90 seconds and sort of tell us a little bit about your books? And Carolyn, why don't you start?
Yeah, so my book is a work of historical biography. It focuses on a man named James Ogilvy, who I like to say is the earliest and most significant American celebrity you've never heard of. I mean, so he became a household name during the early 19th century, about 200 years ago. And so even though he lived so long ago, he had a lot of the hallmarks of celebrity that we associate with modern day celebrity culture. So he had a narcotics habit. He was prone to narcissism. He wore eccentric clothing. But no one at the time saw him as a stereotype, or really no one saw any of those issues as really problematic. Some of his closest friends and biggest supporters were people like Thomas Jefferson, who was president at the time, John Quincy Adams, Benjamin Rush, the physician, Washington Irving, the novelist. But what the book is really about, I think, is the world of early Americans and the early United States, the people who put him on that pedestal. Because I think no matter how we feel today about celebrity, when you think about it and you sort of step back, I think you can see that when you think about who rises to that level of celebrity, who we hate and love as celebrities, it tells us a lot about how we think about ourselves, right? And what I became really fascinated by in this book is the way that focusing on the career of this eccentric celebrity told us a lot about the early United States, which was a fractured and divided place. And it told us a lot about the kind of nation they wanted to live in and the kind of future they wanted. So ultimately, in looking at this one eccentric figure, it becomes a sort of glimpse into an unexpected portrayal of the early US.
Go ahead, John, you're next.
Sure. So, my book stems from several years of reporting I had done on how children in America were impacted by gun violence in different ways. And the book specifically follows two children who I had written stories about for the Washington Post, a little girl in South Carolina named Ava Olson, and a boy in Washington, D.C. named Tyshawn McFadder. And they both experienced gun violence in dramatically different ways. And to me, they represented in some ways sort of the bookends of how children in this country are exposed to gun violence. Ava lived in a rural, gun-loving, overwhelmingly white community where a teenage boy who had access to a firearm, his father's firearm, walked into his dad's bedroom, picked up that gun, killed his father, and then drove to this school where he used to attend and opened fire on a group of first graders, and only stopped because his gun jammed. And one child died, which is why no one remembers that school shooting. And that little boy happened to be Ava's best friend. She adored him. His name was Jacob Hall. And that fundamentally changed the course of Ava's life. She's never been the same person that she was on that day. And Tyshawn experienced gun violence in a very different way, but in a much more common way that many more children in this country experience gun violence. His father was shot in the middle of the day outside of his school. And Tyshawn was so close that Tyshawn could see the police lights from the lobby. And, that entirely changed Tyshawn's life. He suddenly started dealing with anger that he had never dealt with before, and certainly an enormous sense of loss. And what stemmed, though, from the stories that I wrote for the Post is that those two kids became dear friends. And what they had in common, maybe the only thing they had in common, was gun violence. But they were really their best selves with each other. They wrote letters, they sent each other gifts, and they began to FaceTime on an almost weekly basis, almost just becoming each other's therapists. So through their journeys and through the places where they lived, I tried to tell a book that really was meant to expose people to this idea that when we only think about children being impacted by gun violence when they're physically harmed, we're missing the much larger picture. This is not an epidemic that affects hundreds or thousands of kids. It affects literally millions of children every year. So. And I'm quickly going to, I have a blurry background, but I think it's making me glitchy. I'm going to tell the listeners out there that I'm traveling and I'm at someone else's home. So if there are odd things in the background here, I'm just going to ask for forgiveness in advance, but I'll be less glitchy. Yeah, please do.
Yeah. While you do that, I just want to speak quickly about each of your books as a person who was privileged enough to read them. And then I'll start asking some questions. So Carolyn, I'll start with you. I mean, you found so much stuff on James Ogilvy, and I know that that's what you do, and you're an academic and you research, but I'm not those things. And I was so impressed by how much you were able to uncover about him, not only his own writings, but the things that people were saying about him, how you were able to bring this person to life in a way that it felt much more recent than the early 1800s. So I'm sort of curious, where did you get the idea for this book? Like, why James Ogilvy? Why was it important for you to tell his story? Why now? I'd just love to know how he came into your world.
Well, Tracy, first of all, that is the nicest series of sentences anyone has ever offered up to me. So thank you so much.
Okay.
You're my new best friend. So Ogilvy, I had run into him previously. In doing research, I just run across references to him. But then when I was actually starting a different book, and I just thought, I remembered running into these references. Some of them were very flattering. People really idolized him, but other people hated him and said horrible things. And so I just thought, well, why don't I do a little sort of digging for a day or two? I'll see what I can find, and maybe I'll write an article. And at the time, honestly, I was thinking that it would be a funny article. It would be a funny article about somebody who was bananas. And because he had this opium addiction that really affected him throughout his life, and people talked about it because opium was legal at the time. People talked about him, having this habit that was really dangerous. When he got up on stage to perform, he was well known for being an orator, a public speaker. So he did these performances of the spoken word. And when he did that, he wore a toga. I mean, I thought this was all hilarious. And then the more research I did, the more I realized that I had to keep setting aside all of my 21st century assumptions about each one of those eccentric aspects of his character. And I had to tell a story that put people today, readers, into the world of this character. Because once you start to understand the meaning of the toga in the early 19th century, the place of opium at that time, all the different aspects of his sort of emotional life, the more you understand the early United States. And so I just sort of fell in love with the fact that I was learning so much about this world that I hadn't known before. And I mean, that's saying a lot, considering that I've been studying this period for 20 years.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I obviously learned a lot because I have not been studying that period for more than the 300 pages of your book, but I did learn a lot and I was really intrigued. And I know this is going to sound crazy to people at home. There are some parallels in these two books. I know you're like, what is she talking about? We're going to get there. I have some actual questions for both of you that are very connected. But John, I want to talk quickly about your book. Wow. It was, I mean, I'm a person who loves to read books about gun violence. I've read an extraordinary amount, I think, for a person who that's not my job. And specifically school shootings and mass shootings and the Second Amendment, all of these things. And your book was one of the hardest ones for me to read. It was, and I mean, not in a good way. Like, I was really moved by it, I think maybe is how I should say that. I think that one of the parts that really stuck out to me is that it clicked in my mind that maybe we're thinking about gun violence in schools wrong. Maybe we're asking the wrong questions. What do you think people are missing or choosing to ignore or purposefully or not purposefully making fuzzy when they talk about gun violence, especially with children?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think even our understanding of how school shootings affect most kids is wrong. So Townville was a place that I went to in part because no one did remember it, right? And so it was wanting to look through a lens that wasn't Parkland, that wasn't Newtown, that was a forgotten school shooting. And there were so many epiphanies that I had in the reporting of that story. That school shooting was on the front pages for maybe 2 or 3 days, and then it was gone because as soon as editors at newspapers and at news stations have calculated how many kids have died, and the answer is 1 or 2 or 3, they move on. But what I found is that hundreds of children were profoundly affected by what happened that day in 14 seconds. It was a school shooting that ended that quickly. And there were kids on the second floor of that school that didn't even hear the gunshots, that were having nightmares for months, that had become convinced that the shooter was there to kill them personally, because it's an elementary school, right? So that specific shooting in that sort of series of events, seeing all these children who are not physically harmed being permanently damaged by that event, led me to say, well, we should find out how many children have been at schools, on campuses, when school shootings have occurred. So I created a database that, I talk about in the book. That number now, since dating back to Columbine, is over 300,000 kids. It's somewhere around, 320,000 children now who have been on a campus during school hours. This isn't football games after school. This isn't parades. This isn't dances. All places where shootings occur. This is during school hours on campus. In excess of 300,000 kids, all of whom have been affected in some way. Then we think about things like lockdowns, not lockdown drills, but actual lockdowns. Somewhere between 4 and 8 million kids every year in a normal school year go through a lockdown. None of these kids are considered victims of anything, but I know that there are those kids who have written letters goodbye to their parents. They've written wills. They've texted their parents, "I love you," thinking that they're going to die in their schools. These are all children who are, without question, victims of gun violence, and they're victims of school shootings, because it's not hypothetical. These kids are aware of what happened at Parkland. They're aware of what happened in Newtown. They know it could happen in their school because it can happen anywhere. So much of what this book is meant to deliver is that our understanding of the scope of this crisis is totally wrong. It is so much broader than people think, and we have to completely rethink our approach to fixing it too.
I have questions about that. Don't you worry. Carolyn, celebrity, notoriety, it's a huge part of your book, obviously. It's in the title there, in the subtitle. How do you feel like it's evolved from James Ogilvy to what we see now today? How similar do you feel like our Kardashians are to a James Ogilvy? Like, when you were doing this, were you seeing a lot of parallels? And if so, what were you seeing? And were there any really large differences or discrepancies?
Honestly, I was struck most of all by the differences, because Ogilvy lived in a world where, when you think about celebrity is driven by different kinds of media, different kinds of sort of behind the scenes actors, people like agents and publicists and paparazzi and everything else. And Ogilvy lived in a world where he didn't have any of that. The only media he had to use, other than his own voice, were really newspapers. And the newspapers were much less sort of oriented to gossip and that kind of thing. Gossip every once in a while did appear in newspapers, but it was rare. And so the newspapers wound up playing a real role in fueling his celebrity, to be sure. But I was really struck by the differences. Our modern day celebrity culture is quite a different thing than the kind of world where he existed. In some ways, he was one of a very few number of celebrities. But on the other hand, I think that there was also a kind of a tendency for people to be prone to admire him because he was famous, because he had been admired by other people. And so, for example, when he arrived in a town, so say he came to Stanton, Virginia, or Richmond, Virginia, the newspapers would advertise his appearances ahead of time. And the newspapers would say, he has been admired in Philadelphia and New York and Boston and Lexington, Kentucky. And all the most fashionable people in those cities have come to see him. And so, are you going to be the jerk who then writes a review of his performance and says, well, it wasn't as nice as I thought it was going to be? There was even one reviewer in Charleston, South Carolina, who had said something along those lines, that no one is going to criticize this person because he's been admired elsewhere. And we know so little about other kinds of criticism. So I was most of all struck by the differences, but there are some similarities.
Yeah, one of the things that kind of ties your books together is this idea of celebrity and notoriety. I think, John, in your work, it comes up when we talk about the school shooters themselves. And similarly to what you're saying, Carolyn, is that the people, the children who commit these crimes, they don't have, going into it, this like media machine. They have this hope that maybe they'll become famous for what they've done. I'm wondering, John, given that you've been following this for a while and we've had such a history of this in the country, especially since Columbine, how are you seeing this notoriety shifting? And I should say, in your book, you make the choice to include the shooter's name, which I found really interesting and actually really appreciated. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about why people do and don't do that. And then also just about this shift in notoriety as we move towards 20 plus years since Columbine.
Yeah, there has been a really dramatic shift, and there's even a group called No Notoriety that has pushed, prosecutors, journalists to limit how often they name the gunman, and it's worked, and I think it's noble too, because we do know, having studied so many of these young men, that they are incentivized. That is their motivation. They want to be famous. They want to be considered like the Columbine shooters or the Virginia Tech shooter. And they've studied them and they've read their work and they've read stories about them. So we know that is an incentive, and that we have to balance as journalists sort of the obligation to explain how this happened and what this person's motivation was, and what they were thinking, with not glorifying it. Because in the early days, the Columbine shooters were romanticized. They absolutely were, and it spawned a whole generation of people called Columbiners. Those are young people who worship those shooters. But we know that it's worked because the number of people who could name the Uvalde shooter are very few. That is not a household name. That is not a name that very many people know at all. And the same is true of the Oxford shooter. I mean, there's most of the shooters in the last 5 and 10 years, even the Parkland shooter, is not someone that most people could name in the same way that they could very quickly name the Columbine shooters, or would at least recognize those names. So, I chose in one chapter to explore how the shooter came to be who he was, and all the red flags and everything that was missed, because I felt like there was really a journalistic duty. And I think there was something to be learned from how he got to where he was when he was 5 to who he was when he was 14 and he went in and picked up that gun. And, most notably that he was still someone who had access to a gun, which he shouldn't have been. But it is something that I think journalists wrestle with. And I think the accomplishment there, the progress there, is that journalists wrestle with it at all, right? Yeah. And that too, there isn't this immediate, well, he must have been bullied, which was the assumption, right? It's like, well, look at these two nice white kids from the suburbs. Someone must have forced them to do this, which was that was the narrative after Columbine. And it was not based in any reality at all. They weren't bullied. No one forced them to pick up those guns and to commit those atrocities. And we've made a lot of progress as journalists in how we cover that, but it required a lot of mistakes over many, many years.
Yeah. You're right. I can't name a lot of those people, actually, and I feel like I should be able to. Another thing that comes up in both of your books is partisan versus mass appeal. In Carolyn, in your book, we see James Ogilvy he starts off kind of as a partisan figure, and he quickly realizes that if he wants to be a star, though that's not his words, that's my, whatever, anachronistic term. If he wants to be successful, if he wants to make the money going town to town, he needs to sort of ditch that. And similarly to what we've seen in the gun rights, or not gun rights, I guess, a connection with the women. Mm-hmm. There's something that's so important about resonating with women for both James Ogilvy and I think a lot of the activist groups that are for and against guns. So I'm wondering sort of, who do you all see as being served by ignoring or by leaning away from partisan issues? And I don't know if that makes sense, but there's a question there that I'm grappling with about who is served when these moments or people or movements move away from the politics and towards something more generally accessible?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I mean, if you don't mind, I'll just jump in here because Ogilvy, yeah, he started out as a bit of a political radical and a religious radical in that he was an atheist during a time when atheism was really seen as a shocking and scandalous kind of religious view to hold. Um, and yet when he got up on stage, he spoke not in an advocacy way, but about topics that were controversial. He talked about subjects like dueling, which, I mean, anyone who studied early Virginia knows that men were dueling with each other every week. But there were deaths all the time. Alexander Hamilton, of course. He talked about suicide. He talked about female education, which was a controversial issue at the time. And he did much more openly advocate for a strong and sort of vibrant female education. But he didn't talk about slavery, which, is a real surprise, considering where we are now, the kinds of subjects we find interesting about that period. And with that, I've really gone around and around about why he wouldn't have talked about slavery. But I think that it was probably a combination of knowing that he had to sell tickets and that people at the time might not have wanted to buy a ticket to hear someone talk about it. And I think ultimately he just didn't care about the subject the way he could care about other things. He was trying to bring a lot of, especially wealthy and educated women into his audiences. And so speaking about female education could have had a real sort of, meaning there. And he wasn't speaking, to people of color. He wasn't speaking to African Americans, many of whom probably could not have afforded his tickets at the time. So, yeah. So I'm not sure that that's an answer to your question, but it's an interesting one.
I think it is an answer. It's also sort of a not fleshed out question. So very good by you, John.
I love that
question.
I love that question. I feel like I've done so many of these and heard the same things and had to exercise the same muscles. And this is a different sort of thing. I mean, I think that it's become somewhat out of desperation, I think, because the early gun safety movement was more partisan, I think, than it is now. I mean, they've even moved from terminology like gun control to gun safety. I mean, I was cognizant, I think, of the framing in my book, because I very much wanted it to appeal to gun owners. I didn't want to alienate gun owners, because if this is an issue that's going to be solved, it's going to require gun owners to buy in and to say that there's actually more common ground than is often framed. The people on the extremes of this issue, like pretty much any issue today, want division. That is the effort, right? They do want division, especially on the right, frankly. The gun rights activists and the NRA, they want it to feel black and white. They don't want people to feel like there is gray. But the people who are, fighting the good fight and trying to save lives are taking the opposite approach. They want to appeal to the largest audience that they can, because ultimately the effort here is to save lives and really to save kids' lives. And who's on the other side of that issue? I mean, who opposes that, right? Who wants kids to be put in more harm? I think that's a very small group. And there are obvious things that would not deprive gun owners, law-abiding gun owners, of having access to the weapons that they want, and would save hundreds, if not thousands, of lives every year. So I do think that strategy, even in the last 10 to 15 years, really post Newtown, that strategy has changed, because it's been really an appeal to people's humanity, and starting with an idea of, where can we overcome partisan divide, even though clearly I think this is seen as an issue of Democrat versus Republican. It's really not. That's actually not really the reality of that situation.
Okay, so can I just ask you this follow-up? This isn't really about your book, but you're an expert, and I need someone to help me because I cannot be the only person struggling with this. There are so many people who own, I do not own guns. I'm from California. I'm from cities. I'm like it was never part of my life. I'm terrified of guns. So I understand that talking in an event in Virginia, I'm going to sound really like different maybe than a lot of the people here. So I get that. How come we're having such an issue with gun safety if the overwhelming majority of people, gun owners and not gun owners, would do anything for their children? Yeah. And when we frame it in this world of children, so I'm not talking about any other kind of gun violence. I'm talking about school shootings that we're seeing and the things that you're talking about in your book. Is it really just the gun lobby and the NRA and the media, or am I missing? I feel like I got to be missing something.
It is money and power and access to power. So there are about 8 to 10 to 12 Americans who are deciding for 350 million Americans what all the gun laws will be. That's it. So the overwhelming majority, I know, yeah, that exactly, that face. I wish I could I need a gif of that face.
I'm going to cry right now. It's tough.
Well, but there's some hope on the back end of this answer. So the handful of Republican state senators in a handful of states have said it would cost them more to back any of this legislation than it would to oppose it. They've made that simple calculation. That they in Idaho or North Dakota or Arkansas or wherever, that they've said it would be more politically costly to me to oppose the gun lobby than it would be for me to oppose Moms Demand Action. Until that calculus changes, they'll continue to vote the way that they vote, even though 90% of Americans in polls support things like universal background checks, even though the overwhelming majority when I talk to gun owners all over the country, they're the ones suggesting that gun owners should be required to have licenses. That's an extreme idea on Capitol Hill. That would be, there'd be calls of fascism if people were asked to have, and these are gun owners in places like Kentucky and South Carolina and Florida saying, you know what, people should have to get a license. And the reason is they know they could get a license. They would, be able to pass the background check. They don't mind. So I do think, though, in our lifetimes that we'll see that shift, because whatever we want to call it, the lockdown generation, the Columbine generation, they are going to get older. And I believe that they will refuse to allow their kids to grow up in the same world that they did, where they have to hide in their classrooms 5 or 6 times a year to pretend that a bear, or when they get a little bit older, a man with a gun is somewhere in their school trying to murder them. I don't think they'll continue to tolerate that. So I think we will see that those balances change in our lifetimes. And it could be 20 years from now, but I do think that will happen and that people will just not tolerate it. I mean, that was one of the subjects in my book, was a Republican lawmaker who, in his mind, he foresaw the future. He said, eventually, if we don't compromise on these obvious things, the Second Amendment is going to be swept away, because they're going to remember 20 years of obstinance. They're going to remember all these years of us being unwilling to compromise on anything. And they're going to say, we don't need to negotiate with you anymore. We have all the power. The Second Amendment's going away, which is not what he wants. And I think really not what most Americans want. I don't think most Americans want the Second Amendment to be repealed. They want common sense gun laws that would save children's lives.
Okay, thank you for giving us hope.
A little bit.
Gold star for you. I should say this really quickly for folks at home. Please leave us questions in the chat on YouTube or Facebook or wherever you're watching, because we will get to questions. So if things come up, please leave them. There's someone there taking care of the questions to make sure that we get them. Okay, another thing that I feel like I'm doing a comparative literature class. Another thing that I saw between these two works is that there's this like warning against charismatic people with strong opinions, right? We see it very forwardly with James Ogilvy. There's another guy who's also writing into the newspaper being like, hey, Philadelphia, this guy's a jerk. Don't pay attention to him. And then sort of, John, what you were just talking about, the political leaders who are sort of maybe holding this conversation a hostage feels like a very too on the nose word in this, given this, but that's kind of the sense. I'm wondering, like, and I guess, Carolyn, you're the right person for this. You know about celebrity. I'm wondering, what is the balance between celebrity as, like, charismatic figure as celebrity, because that's what we're drawn to, versus charismatic figure as demagogue? I don't know. Like, where does that shift happen between love what you're saying, super into you, to this person is dangerous and harmful?
Well, I mean, is there a line? I think the line exists in people's minds, and we see this today, right? I mean, when you have say political leaders who are just incredibly gifted in front of audiences, one of the things that will come up inevitably is the question of, well, is this person simply, they have the gift of this charisma and they're sort of sucking in all these weak-minded sheep, right? The sheeple. And I think that, you definitely saw that during Ogilvy's career, because he was sort of an awkward and skinny and gaunt looking person in personal life. And yet when he got up on stage, he sort of transformed into this charismatic, wonderful speaker. And everyone talked about, feeling goosebumps rise on their arms, and him making them cry at different points during his talks. And I do think that when you think about the great speeches that you've heard in your life, the ones that did move you or rouse you to action or bring you to tears, those moments are so meaningful, and yet they also bring up those anxieties about, well, what's happening to me? How am I getting sucked into this kind of this person's amazing gift with words? And so I think that there isn't a line, because in Ogilvy's time, one person might absolutely, Thomas Jefferson might absolutely talk to all of his friends about how important it was to have someone like Ogilvy who had a gift for reaching people all over the country. But then someone else, like the person you mentioned in the newspaper, might say, whoa, here we have exactly what we should be worried about. We've seen demagogues in history before. This person has the ability to woo people who don't have a critical sensibility, and they'll be sucked into whatever he might be selling ultimately. Maybe he is trying to turn us all into atheists. And so it's really, in the eye of the beholder, I think.
Yeah, I think charisma and certainly propaganda, which is maybe just an inch to the right, has played an enormous role in our inability to make any progress on this issue. When you talk to even those sort of same gun owners, when you talk to, they'll say, well, I agree with this law and this law and this law, but I can't support it because of the slippery slope. That's the argument you hear, right? It's that because they've been told by charismatic leaders on the gun rights movement or the NRA that if you give them any law, they're going to take your guns away. They're going to take your guns away. They're going to take your guns away, right? And it's one of those lies. If you say it often enough, lots of people have come to believe it. And these are reasonable people. They're people who actually, in theory, support all of these changes, but they're afraid, right? And that is so much of, I think, the most charismatic leaders in history, the most certainly influential, were people who knew how to wield fear. Certainly, in Germany, we saw that, and we've even seen that in this country in the last, 6 years or so, that people know how to wield fear. And that is consistently been the case. When we've seen, gun sales spike, it's when, they thought President Obama was going to pass all sorts of laws and take their guns away. So we saw these enormous spikes in guns. We've seen gun sales spike during the pandemic because people are afraid. We saw during, the George Floyd protests, people in the suburbs were suddenly buying guns. So we've seen, and it's because people are being motivated by those charismatic leaders who are saying you should be afraid, you should go buy more guns, you shouldn't support any kind of gun laws, because this is the end result. And it is seldom based in reality, but it's incredibly effective. And if they've heard it enough times, then people become immovable.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you both sort of a question that is maybe not fair, but I'm going to do it because that's my vibe. Carolyn, why, these are basically like, why isn't this a thing kind of question. Why did James Ogilvy disappear from cultural consciousness? Like, what was it about him that made him become a forgettable celebrity?
You mean, Tracy, you're asking me to give away one of the big twists?
Oh, no, but don't give away the twist. Sorry, don't give away. No spoilers. I'm a spoiler-free zone. So, there is a very late twist in this book that I was like, holy cow, I'm on the second to last chapter? Don't give away the twist.
No. I'm joking. So I think that, again, if you imagine the very early United States, a place where Ogilvy was one of very few celebrities. He sort of took the country by storm. He wound up traveling. The U.S. had 19 states by about 1817. Ogilvy went to 17 of them. He was just an amazingly well-traveled person. And I think what's really interesting about that phenomenon is that he did visit, Philadelphia 5 times, New York 5 times. He went up to Montreal and Quebec. But by the end, a lot of his own demons, his penchant for a bit of narcissism, his penchant for fantasy. He told everyone he was the heir to an earldom in Scotland. A lot of these things started to catch up with him. And so in some ways, some key people began turning away from him. And my best analogy is that many people reading the newspapers began to feel a little bit like maybe some of us felt when we were no longer 13 years old and we were in love with boy bands or something. I mean, it was Ogilvy came to occupy a place in American culture that resembled an early youthful infatuation with somebody who was important. And they turned away as if it somehow indicated that the country was growing up and they had a different vision for what the future of the country might be. And so, there's more to it than that. I don't want to give too much of that away, but there is a way in which celebrity, I think we can see this better than his culture could. Celebrity often has a contained time period. Right. And at some point you start to look a little bit different to people than you did in the beginning.
Yeah. First of all, boy band is speaking my language. Thank you. Really feel seen by you. One of the things that I actually thought about while reading your book was about Alexander Hamilton and how he has become a celebrity again in a way that he just actually wasn't before. Right. Lin-Manuel Miranda read that book and was like, oh, this is a hip hop musical, which I don't know if that's exactly how it happened, but it's a cute story. But like, to me, I'm of the age where my only knowledge of Alexander Hamilton before the musical was the Got Milk commercial, the Aaron Burr Got Milk commercial. And that was about Aaron Burr. It wasn't about Alexander Hamilton. So it's funny to think that like celebrity can come later, or like that it can be revived in certain ways. And that's so much about the audience and less maybe about than the person, or at least that kind of came up for me. John, why don't we care about this thing for you is it's kind of twofold. Two things that came up to me that I was like, wow, these are things that are missing from the conversation around guns that I'd love to hear more about, are about Black kids and brown kids, which you talk about a lot in the book. And you say that 60% of gun violence is at schools that are predominantly children of color. And my guess is that that's specifically like Latina children and Black children's schools. And then also, why don't we seem to care? So why don't we care about that, which I sort of know the answer to, but love to hear you talk about it. Yeah. But also, why don't we care about the mental health of young people? school? Like, why are we so okay with our kids being traumatized and upset? My children are too young to go. Well, I guess they just started preschool, but they're too young to have like a real conversation with them. They're two. But I know from other people, other friends of mine who have older children, how difficult and how traumatizing these lockdown, not only the actual lockdowns, but even just the drills are. I remember when I was a kid, I grew up in California, we had the earthquake drills.
Mm-hmm.
And every once in a while, when my mind starts wandering, I'm like, what if there's an earthquake? And I start to like sweat. So I'm just wondering like about, I guess the what's not there question is sort of like, why aren't we talking more about the violence that's happening at schools that aren't mass shootings? And I think I know the answer. And then why aren't we talking about the mental health of these kids? Because also the kids in your book can't get services.
Right.
So any and everything about that would be great.
So yes, the answer to the first question is racism. Period. That's it. Right. There's an expectation that certain children in this country will be exposed to more gun violence and violence in general than other children. That is absolutely true of kids in Tyshawn's neighborhood. That the way that we societally, I mean, we're talking, 2-3 miles from the richest people on the planet, the most powerful people on the planet. And there is so little care given to people in his community and kids in his community because of the color of their skin. And it's just absolutely the case. And, it bleeds into every aspect of society, the way that, money is spent by cities and states, the way that the media covers things. I mean, it's just the truth, the way that even local news, right? People who are embedded in these communities do not respond the same way when a shooting occurs in this neighborhood to kids of this color versus kids in this neighborhood who are a different color. It is a fact. So, the way that I sort of see as a journalist to get around that is to go tell humanizing stories in every neighborhood, right? Is to go into those places, because that's what people have done from a distance. They've dehumanized those children. They've said, well, that's just the way it is for kids who live in that neighborhood. And when you go tell their stories and you go fill them out completely as human beings, the human beings that they are, who have hopes and dreams and who get upset and who are hilarious and who are everything that every other kid is, it makes it harder to turn away. So that's sort of the way that I see to get at it, is to go back and go back and go back and to keep telling the stories. I mean, I spent all summer in Uvalde, and I've never seen children treated. I've never seen a community treated the way that those people are being treated. Ever. It's not Newtown, right? The way that the families from Newtown were treated is radically different than the way that the families of Uvalde are being treated. And it's complicated. I don't think it's as simple as racism, but I have a hard time believing that racism has not played a role.
Certainly.
To the second question, I think in part kids don't vote. I think that's a part of it. And I think, too, that kids have a hard time expressing their trauma. Even if kids are dealing with huge amounts of anger and pain, they have a hard time expressing it. And it manifests in unexpected and unpredictable ways that adults have a hard time drawing a line between the terrible thing the kid has gone through and the way that they're behaving. It often comes out as anger, right? So cities in this country are finally sort of catching up to the fact that when a kid comes in on a Monday and maybe has an outburst, that we shouldn't expel them. There's been this shift from it's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you, right? That's the question that we should be asking. And, I talk about it in the book, this idea that kids are resilient, right? It's a label we put on kids. Kids are resilient. It is a way for adults to be dismissive of kids' lived experiences. And it's a way to say, they'll be fine, they'll be fine, they'll be fine. I heard that so much in Uvalde. But, the children that I was, spending months with, who seemed fine in public, were having debilitating nightmares in private. And that's the reality. That is the reality. But again, those kids don't vote, and they have a hard time articulating what it is that they're going through. So, we just have to, as journalists, I have to just keep shining lights and hoping that, you break through. with people.
Yeah. Yeah. So true. I mean, adults have a hard time expressing their traumas.
Right.
You know,
Right.
I feel like to the first point about the racism, one of the things that I've also seen, another book made me think of this, which I know we're not talking about other books tonight, but I'm going to because I talk about books.
Mm-hmm.
But Andrea Elliott's Invisible Child, she writes about homelessness and poverty in New York City through one child whose name is Dasani and her entire family. And I was lucky enough to interview Andrea on the show. And one of the things that she said many times about the book is that she didn't want to focus on the parents because it's so often that people blame the adults and the children for the parents. So like what you're saying is that certain children are expected to endure a certain amount of violence because of the color of their skin and where they live. But what that's really saying is certain people's parents are insufficient humans who can't take care of their children and therefore they deserve to be shot at. Right. And I just think that like the unpacking of some of that, like I know that to be true, but I never thought about more specifically what we're really saying when we say that certain kids should have resource officers in their schools to arrest them, right? Like that's saying that's, you know, anyways, not to get too
I'll just that's a really astute point. I'll quickly just say this, that, you know, a reason that I've spent 5.5 years writing about how kids are impacted by gun violence is because you cannot blame a child for being victimized by gun violence. You can't do it. You can't say that 8 or 10-year-old, regardless of where they're from or what they look like, is at fault. And so it was a way to engage on this issue because people, once a kid hits 15, 16 plus, it's their fault. In a group of people's minds in this country, they can be dismissive because they say, well, that's that person's fault.
Yeah.
They must have done something to bring this on themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's a smart way to get at the issue too, because I do think it kind of, it's sort of like, again, a really bad use of words, but it disarms the reader in a lot of ways. And it feels really punny, and that's not on purpose.
It's hard to avoid, trust me.
Yeah, I'm sure you know. Before we move on to questions from the audience, I do have a few questions for you all about the great state of Virginia, because this is the Library of Virginia Awards, and you both live in Virginia. Yes. Okay. Yes. Great. Nailed it. I want to know if at all or how Virginia has played a part in your process in writing the book.
So James Ogilvy was an immigrant from Scotland. He came to Virginia as a 20-year-old to teach school and wound up bouncing around everywhere from Fredericksburg to Tappahannock to Richmond to just outside of Monticello in Charlottesville, and taught for 15 years. And in fact, was a renowned teacher of elite boys' schools at the time, wound up teaching people who would go on to become U.S. senators, governors of states, important military figures. He had a really outsized role as an educator in the state of Virginia. And it's actually as an educator that he became known to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson wound up hiring him to be the tutor for his own grandson. And the problem, though, with teaching, and especially for teaching in Virginia, was that teaching took 12 to 14 hours a day. You were often the only figure at your school who was teaching people of a range of ages from maybe 8 to maybe 14 or 15. And he taught all the subjects, everything from science and philosophy to Latin to math, and on and on. And so a big part of the early stages of the book is about his life in Virginia. And he continued to sort of come back through on his way to different parts of the world. And in fact, I would say that it was his time in Richmond, particularly, when he began to discover his own gifts as a public speaker that led him ultimately to bail out on teaching altogether and head out on the road to become a public speaker.
So the state played several roles in my book. One, in many ways, you could argue that Virginia is home to the problem. I mean, the NRA's headquarters are in Virginia, right outside the city. Virginia was also for many, many years, DC's primary gun supplier. When we talk about, you hear all the time, people talk about, well, gun laws don't work because look at DC and Virginia, or DC and Chicago and New York, right? There's still gun violence in those cities, but they have very strict gun laws. Well, that's nonsense because we don't have hard borders in the United States. Like when you travel from Virginia to DC with 300 guns in the trunk, there isn't a border patrol officer stopping you to check your trunk. So, that has been the pipeline into DC for a long time. From a writing standpoint, it was a lovely place to write a book. I will say that. When I started writing this book, I was a very recent Virginia transplant, and then going through the pandemic and sort of exclusively writing from home these days with my window of all the changing leaves has actually been pretty comforting and delightful. So, but there was that moment in the book where I drove from Tyshawn's neighborhood. I wanted to reconstruct sort of the line from Tyshawn's neighborhood to the NRA headquarters, where they house this museum, basically of the gun, and inside it they have this sort of fantasy ideal really of a child's bedroom, and it's just chock full of guns, and I wanted to juxtapose how people in Tyshawn's neighborhood are affected and view guns, and then this absurd idealized view of guns just a few miles down the road.
So a question that I ask on my podcast all the time is about process, and it's about, how do you write? How often, where are you? Do you listen to music, or is it a silent space? Do you light a candle? Do you have snacks and beverages? And I just want to put an asterisk there. That one's the most important question, so make sure you answer that when you get there. But sort of, how do you write? Where are you?
Oh, I bet our answers are going to be really different, John, because I have to say that, for one thing, I write in draft after draft after draft. And I know that I've envied journalists my whole life for their ability to write quickly and effectively. But with this book, I was trying to write a book that brought the past alive to a wider group of readers than would have read my first book, which was a much more academic book. Academics need to get tenure at their universities, and that's what that book did. And so I think with this one, I was struggling through multiple drafts, trying to find the right voice to both illuminate complicated aspects of the past, complicated aspects of Ogilvy's life and his emotional life, while also not losing the academic readers who might be reading it as well. And so yeah, lots of drafts. And I have to say, I have never been a smoker. But if I were, I would have smoked a lot of cigarettes, because I drank a lot of tea, a lot of coffee in the writing of this. I almost always have a glass of water. In fact, I've got one right in front of me right now. It really helps. It really helps the flow, right? That there's something about being able to sip something and keep moving forward. I don't listen to music, actually. I almost never do, unless I'm trying to block out some outdoor noise.
Any snacks?
Sometimes I'll have some almonds, but I will also say, moving away from the topic of snacks, I will say that I also talk through a lot of my problems with people. And so I might call a friend. I have wonderful neighbors who talked me through a lot of the sorts of things that I was trying to think about with the writing of this book. And so, that's my process.
I love that. You're the first person I've ever interviewed in over 250 episodes of my show who's ever said that they talk through their problems of their books with people. I'm sure people do it, but you're the first one who's ever said that to me.
See, and now I feel like John is going to say, "Oh yeah, I just sat down and wrote this in a morning."
No, no. The process was anguish. So I mean, that's I can. I mean, I once had a journalism professor who said, "No one likes to write. We like to have written." And I think there's a lot of truth in that. I often wonder, in the middle of it, why I'm doing it at all. So I'm a compulsive, habitual, obsessive structurer of everything, whether I'm writing on deadline. I mean, I anchored our January 6th story, and that was a case where, of course, I had a matter of minutes really to write versus something like this where you have 9 months to write. But I structure everything, whether I'm writing in a matter of minutes to, over the course of a year. So I had, most of the stories I write are long. They're magazine length. They're, somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 words for the posts. Writing something, 10 times longer than that was intimidating. It was hard for me because I couldn't sort of keep it all in my head. I sort of sometimes think of stories as like a road, and you can see from one end to the other. But with a book, you really can't do that. You can't sort of keep it all in your head. So I had these massive sheets all over the wall with breaking down each chapter. This was also, structurally, it was a challenging book because the ages of the kids, they didn't have enough life experience to carry every chapter in a book. It wasn't possible. They could certainly carry a story on their own. So I had to think about connective tissue, geography, theme, and for the book to not feel episodic, because the entire book couldn't be about Ava and Tyshawn. It would have been, half the length. I write mostly in the middle of the night. Those are my prime writing hours from like 10 to 2. I like the quiet. I like the silence at that hour. I drink a lot. I'm the only journalist who doesn't drink coffee. I drink lots of Earl Grey and lots.
Me too. I'm an Earl Grey gal.
Yeah, big Earl Grey. That got me through. It's what I'm drinking right now. Advertisement for Earl Grey. And I do snack. I am a snacker. I'm very cognizant of, I don't sleep very much, but if I get sort of less than like 5.5, I can really feel the difference in the words that come out of my fingers the next day. So, but I am a snacker. I'm mostly baby carrots. I'm a lot of baby carrots when
You're a healthy snacker, John.
Well, I know. I'm a dark chocolate snacker too. I'll say that. I do the dark chocolate. Which
That's healthy chocolate, John. Nice try.
No, I know. I mean, I'm a chips eater.
There we go.
But not when I'm writing. I'm very, very sort of hyper focused. But in the days after I filed, or the days after I would finish a chapter, is when I would.
That's when the chips come out. Celebration.
Yeah.
I love that. As you can tell, I'm a huge snacker. Carolyn, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but John, you had that great line from your professor about how we don't like to write, we like to have written, and I'm actually finding that used to be agony for me, and it's still slow, and it takes me a long time to figure out what I want to say, what I think about what I'm writing. Joan Didion had this great line about how she writes so that she knows what she thinks, which I've always really loved that line. I really do love writing after all this time because it's that process of taking a lot of the mess of American history and finding a path through it. You mentioned with your stories being able to see down the road. I'm never able to see it until I start writing. And that's the thing that illuminates, where I'm going.
Oh, I love that.
I like to edit. I'll say that. I like the revision process a great deal. I like to cut and cut, whatever it is that I'm doing. And I will say over time, it's gotten easier. Partly the subject matter is partly what makes it a challenge for me. Is I'm sort of bathing in anguish, in people's anguish all the time, which is its own challenge.
Yeah. We're going to take some questions from the audience. If you at home have questions, please leave it either on YouTube or Facebook, wherever you're watching. But we'll get started. And then depending on what we have, I have a few more questions for you all as well. So we'll start here for Carolyn. Was there one specific finding in your research that made you go, okay, I have to write this book?
You know, it was really when I was writing about his toga. I mean, he wore a toga on stage. And that is so reminiscent for me, because I'm old, of John Belushi in Animal House, right? I mean, I just imagine drunk frat guys with, you know, hairy chests and so on. And I couldn't believe what was so baffling about the toga at first was the fact that nobody made fun of it. So of all of his detractors or people who were skeptical of his gifts, nobody went around saying, and the fool is wearing a toga, you know? And that sort of opened up this whole world of what the toga meant in the early 19th century, but also the kind of hopeful and idealistic visions of the future of the United States that it conveyed. And the more I wrote about it, the more I thought about it, the more I started to think, well, I can write an entire chapter about a toga. This is not going to be an article. This is going to be something bigger. And I have to say that every one of the sort of more topical digressions that I wound up going into, the book is, you know, mostly it follows Ogilvy throughout his career, but I do have these sort of blips of looking at different kinds of themes and unpacking these themes in American history. Yeah, the more I thought, Ogilvy was eccentric and unexpected, and he doesn't look like anybody else in the early United States, but his career and his what he imagined for the early United States reveals so much about a world because he was so unusual. And so, yeah, it was the toga. What can I say?
Sucker for a toga.
Yeah.
John, this one's for you. Have you stayed in touch with the families you write about? How do those relationships evolve after you're done reporting?
So it depends. You know, I've written about so many families through the years, and I sort of don't have the emotional energy to keep up with everybody I write. For me to keep doing this work, I have to let some of those go. Not that anybody who reaches out to me or follows up any of those families I've ever written about, I'm always responsive. It's different certainly for Ava and Tyshawn's family. I talk to, you know, Donna, Ty's mom, every other month at least. Same thing with Ava's mom. I just keep up with them, and I don't really ever see a point where that will end. You know, I am just interested in their kids, right, and where they're going to end up, who they're going to be in life, and I'm deeply invested in their lives. So, you know, Tyshawn's father was killed in 2017, and his killer was just convicted last month of the killing. It took that long, and he'd been arrested very shortly after the shooting. So, you know, Tyshawn's 5 years older now. You know, Ava is still struggling and with all sorts of things. She never did go back to school. She's still on medications and still struggling in a lot of ways. Team sports have helped her a great deal. She got into softball and some basketball and soccer, and that was a way for her to get out some of her frustration and anger, and just, you know, socializing with other kids who treat her like another kid. So, you know, I have a great deal of hope, certainly for both of those kids.
Is she still ice skating?
Not so much now. Yeah, not so much. The pandemic kind of blew that up because they closed the rink where she was going. But these other, I think in some ways the team sports have been more helpful for her. Yeah.
Here's another audience question for John. This one's long. Bear with me, everyone. Sorry. Hi, John. I have felt depression on and off when passing by or just reminiscing about the Carter Jones Fonticello Park in Richmond, Virginia, where Micaiah Dixon was shot and killed. Because of proximity and meeting her parents and knowing neighbors that grew up with the parents has led me to feel frustrated and motivated to do more to prevent gun violence. Have you talked with people in proximity of the violence and how they have dealt with it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Gun violence, I think more than most things, leaves people who are not physically harmed to believe that they are not deserving of their feelings, that they convince themselves that their trauma isn't real, that someone had it worse. And that's usually because someone's gone, because someone's dead, or because they've lost a limb. So they think, well, I really shouldn't feel this way. And I've seen that all the way from people like this person asking the question, who knew the parents and just sort of lived in the area, to people like, I think immediately of a woman who's one of the subjects in the book who survived the Columbine shooting, lost one of her best friends, ran through the school, didn't see anyone killed and wasn't killed herself, and would not go see a therapist. And this is someone who went on to become a counselor, head of counseling for Denver Public Schools. So she understood secondary trauma. She'd studied it. And not until, she was a counselor one day, hiding in a classroom during a lockdown, and she had a full-blown panic attack, did she realize, I need to go see someone. This is like a decade after the shooting. She convinced herself that she was not deserving. So what I tell people first is go see a therapist. If you're struggling, go talk to somebody. There is no shame in that. It took me a long time. It was Uvalde that prompted me finally to take my own advice and to go get a therapist, because my wife and my editor insisted on it. Because that shooting really, just that day, really deeply affected me, because I knew what that community and those kids were headed toward. So, people need to go seek help. There is no shame in that. And you can't be supportive of other people. You can't help other people until you fix what it is that you're dealing with. So I think that's step one, is go find someone who can help. And there's a lot of people who can.
I'm going to ask one of my questions that I didn't get to yet, but I want to get to. This is an event about literature and books and things, so it would be remiss not to ask this. For people who love each of your books, what are some other books you might recommend to them that are in conversation or similar in some way? And I'll leave that up to you to decide for further good reads. Carolyn, why don't you start?
Oh, I'm trying to think about some of the books I read and reread while I was writing. And I'll just start with one. It's an older book now, a Pulitzer Prize winner, and a beautiful read. It's by the historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. It's called A Midwife's Tale, and it was probably written 30 years ago, but it's about a midwife in what was then not yet a state of Maine. She lived in rural Maine and worked as a midwife among a very rural community. And what the historian Ulrich has done in the book is reconstructed this woman's diary. And the diary is incredible, telling incredible stories about the communities that she's treating, a rape case, every once in a while, a dead child, people experiencing different kinds of epidemics. But what Ulrich did was take a diary that on its face is almost incomprehensibly brief. The midwife just jotted down very brief notes, very seldom even offering up any emotion. And yet she unpacked this entire world. That's really been one of the books that has influenced me the most in the writing of my own book.
I can recommend a couple. Gary Young's Another Day in the Death of America is a tremendous book, and it's very good. Yeah, and he was kind enough to write the Times review of my book, which was really a treat. And then An American Summer and There Are No Children Here by Alex Kotlowitz. Those are two tremendous books. So those immediately come to mind. Columbine is a great book as well. So there's a lot of great literature, on this subject. What I tried to do, and I've tried to do in this universe where there is so much great literature, is telling these stories in this book through the eyes of children, right, is that so often when we write about kids, it is told through the adults around them. And kids have so much more to say. I'm constantly sort of preaching this to other journalists, is go ask the kid what they think, because they often have a lot to say and have really complex views of the world. So, but those are books that achieve that, I think, as well. Those are books that don't shy away from understanding what a kid's perspective was.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, the Gary Young book and the Dave Cullen book are two of my favorites.
Yeah, very good.
It's just so good. I teased this earlier and I didn't ask you. And so since we have a second, John, I do want to ask you, you detailed this, I think, in the epilogue or the afterword, but what are some things that you see that could help? And I believe in the book, you sort of preface that with like, these are not huge things.
Yeah.
So I'd love for you to just detail that for people listening, especially for folks who feel like maybe they want to get involved or feel like there's something they should be pushing their politicians toward.
Sure. Yeah. I because I'm a journalist, and I have to always be careful with opinion. I really found things that I thought were based entirely on reporting, based on the findings, things that could be supported by what we know, and what could actually make a difference. The first and most obvious is we need to invest a whole lot more money into research. You can't fix major problems unless you know what's causing them and how to stop them. And because of the NRA's efforts, we went 25 years effectively without the CDC spending any money on researching gun violence or supporting private researchers from researching gun violence. And, it would be like if, 6 months into the pandemic, someone had declared, well, I don't really like the politics of the vaccine, so we're going to cut off all funding into vaccine research. And we're just going to live with this. I mean, that is a one-to-one comparison. That's exactly what we did. We looked at a pandemic that was killing tens of thousands of people and said, I don't like what the findings show. We're going to stop researching it. So that's an obvious thing. In the last few years, we've started finally, even under President Trump, there was money. It was symbolic mostly, but it started under his presidency. So we should be spending hundreds of millions of dollars researching gun violence and what would stop it. Adults should lock up their guns. I mean, this is such a simple thing, but I say this, there's a big faction of Americans, the only form of gun violence they care about are school shootings. That's it. They don't care about suicides. They don't care about, gun violence in Tyshawn's neighborhood. They don't, and they'll never be convinced to care, but they do care about school shootings. And so what I tell those people is if that's the only thing you care about, if say after Columbine, if adults just started locking up their guns, every American adult just said, I'm just not going to let my gun fall into the hands of a child, about 60% of school shootings would not have happened. So overnight, if that's the only thing we changed about the way we think about guns, handle guns, or responsible with guns in this country, if we just said, do not let a child get a hold of a gun, more than half the school shootings would just end overnight. And that is something, it doesn't say that you can't go buy your AR-15. It just says you have to be responsible with it. You can't let a child get access to it. And if you do, you're going to be held criminally liable. So then the third thing, too, I think the obvious thing for most people is background checks. We know that background checks would make a meaningful difference. They would stop all sorts of people who should not have access to guns from getting guns, and they would stop things like the gun show loopholes where you can go to a gun show and buy a bunch of guns from a private dealer, and then you can go sell those guns on the streets of Chicago, which is what happens all the time. So those are obvious things that would not infringe on any law-abiding citizen's right to buy or own a gun, and would save literally thousands of lives every year if we just did those things.
Yeah, gosh, I hate your book. It's like I'm getting worked up. Okay, I don't think there's any more questions from the audience. So I just have one more question and then I will yield back the remainder of my time. I think it's only 10 minutes. So probably by the time we get through it, it'll be like 3 minutes. But I love to give you each the last word on your own books, which is, what do you hope that people will keep in mind as they read your book, if they have not read it yet?
Most of all, I hope that my book teaches us to be hesitant to draw direct comparisons between our world and the past, because I think that, I mean, famously, people have talked about history as, the past is a foreign country. And what I have really wanted to do with this book is to take people into a world that, although there are so many familiar aspects of it, it's also a place where we need different money, and we need, to learn the language, and we need to understand that the way they conceived of everything from mental health to an opium addiction was different. And once you start to understand the past on their terms, we can understand the kinds of human beings who inhabited that world. And so yeah, I want people to read my book and think about how interesting it is to try to understand a United States that seems unfamiliar in many ways.
That's a hard answer to follow, but that's a great answer. This maybe sounds strange, but I really, I do think that my book should deliver an element of hope to people. And so much of the book is spent trying to get you to recognize something that maybe you haven't seen before, right? That we think of gun violence in too small of a way, especially as it relates to kids. We think about how many died, how many got shot, and that's where our care and our thinking ends. So the book is initially supposed to deliver that, hey, the scope of this problem is so much bigger than you thought, which is certainly not a hopeful idea, but it's reality, right? Is we have to first recognize the world for what it is. And that's that millions of children, literally millions of children every year, are profoundly affected by gun violence. And whenever I need to convince someone of that, I think about this study that was done in Chicago that found that children who lived in a neighborhood where a homicide occurred, they just had to live in the neighborhood, did worse on their test scores 1 week later. They didn't have to know the person. They didn't have to hear the gunshot. They didn't have to see it. They just had to know that someone in my neighborhood was shot to death. And a week later, they did worse on their test scores. Those kids are victims of gun violence. They are. Gun violence is a thing that we've let get worse and worse and worse in those kids' neighborhoods. And then we're asking them to perform well on their tests. So that's step one, right? Is recognizing that this is a bigger problem than most people think. Two, it is not unsolvable at all. We think of this as a binary thing. So we're never going to get to a point where we have 0 people dying of gun violence in this country. But if we went from 45,000 or 40,000 to 20,000 or 25, that's worth it. That's in excess of 10,000 lives and all their children. This year I've done a 2-part series on the children who lose their parents to gun violence and how often that happens and how overlooked that population is. But it's not an unsolvable problem. And these sorts of things, these small recommendations that come at the end of the book, would move the dial in a meaningful way, right? So in the same way that the vaccines didn't eradicate COVID, they saved thousands of lives. We could do small things that would save thousands of lives and would prevent things from Uvalde from happening. That was a preventable school shooting. There are things we could have done societally that the state of Texas could have done that could have prevented that from happening. So I think that it's those two things, right? First, recognizing that the scope of the problem is bigger than we think. And then 2, recognizing that it's not hopeless and there are things we can do, and that it's going to just take, really, for radical change to come, it's just going to take that tipping point that we're not that far away from. And that I firmly believe people who are 23 and younger, who've lived with this since they were born, since they stepped into schools, will not tolerate it when they're in their 30s and 40s and are sending their kids to these schools.
I hope you're right. I really do. I really, really do. All right. I think that's it for us tonight. Before I bring back Joseph, I just want to say thank you to both of you for talking with me tonight, but also for writing your books and for the care that you put into your storytelling. I also want to thank the Library of Virginia, of course, for letting me, an outsider, talk to 2 great Virginians about some great Virginians. And for people at home watching, please make sure that if you have not yet, you pick up a copy of each of these books. You can do it tonight. There's a link that says thevirginiashop.org. to support both Carolyn and John's work. And I think that's everything. And thanks, Joseph, for letting me do this too. Joseph is one of my good friends, and John, funnily enough, we connected over Columbine years ago. That was the book that kind of like one of the books that brought us together.
Wow.
I mean, like, I think when we met in 2010, it was like a thing we talked about. But thank you both so much. And I'm wishing you both a lot of luck on Saturday at the awards. I hope you both win, unless you're both competitive. And then I hope whoever's the most competitive person wins, because you'll be the most upset if you lose. But what do they say? It's an honor just to be nominated. So congratulations to you both for your work. And I think Joseph gets to come back.
I do. I think we met before 2010, but thank you.
We connected over. That was like
yes.
between us that we love.
Yes. Well, middle school was fun. As we close the evening, I'd like to thank all of you for being here. This was an incredible conversation. It really could have kept going. You all were remarkable. And Tracy, thank you so much for taking these two very different books and weaving a wonderful narrative around both of them and finding their individual strengths. It was really a fascinating time. So thank you. And thank you, John and Carolyn, for sharing so much. I'm halfway through both of your books. I'm not going to finish before Saturday, but I'm excited to finish them both. Thank you at home for joining, whether you're joining us live or joining in the future. We appreciate you being here. We hope that you'll consider supporting the Library of Virginia by visiting the link on your screen or in the comments. The 2022 Literary Awards winners will be announced this Saturday, October 15th at the Library of Virginia, and I'll echo Tracy's well wishes and good luck to both of you and all of the finalists. For more information can be found at the library's website. And thank you all again, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you.